Last week, we saw the Ukrainians essentially destroy an entire battalion of North Korean soldiers. I think that created a weakness in the Russian front line, which the Ukrainians demonstrated the ability to exploit very quickly.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And today we are joined by Major General Mick Ryan. Mick served with the Australian Army for more than 30 years and commanded units from platoon to brigade level. He's adjunct fellow at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. And his latest book is called The War for Ukraine. And he writes regular updates on the war in his Substack. Mick, great to see you again. Happy New Year. Your article this week gave initial reaction to Ukraine's new Kursk offensive operation. How would you assess it now? Because when you wrote it at the time, you said it's really early days. We won't know yet exactly how far this will go and what the intentions are.
Yeah, g'day, Kate. Happy New Year to you. It's good to be back with you again. Well, I think with the remove of a couple of days, it's fair to state that this was probably not the big offensive that some might have hoped that it would have been. It appears to have been a smaller scale, opportunistic series of attacks by the Ukrainians in the northern and northeastern parts of the Kursk salient. It seems to have secured a little bit of terrain, but at the same time, the Ukrainians have had to fend off Russian counterattacks, particularly in the western part of the salient. So all told, not a huge amount of movement on that front.
That said, what has it actually demonstrated, this assault, about what the Ukrainians have learned about going on the offensive in the months since they first invaded Kursk?
Well, they've certainly learned to better integrate things like electronic warfare drones, engineers for mine clearing, counter-drone operations against Russian surveillance systems, and ultimately battlefield leaders making the most of opportunities. Last week, we saw the Ukrainians essentially destroy an entire battalion of North Korean soldiers. I think that created a weakness in the Russian front line, which the Ukrainians demonstrated the ability to exploit very quickly.
And the question you were posing when you wrote that Substack was, is this it? What's the answer to that question?
I think it is. There's not a lot else we're seeing at the moment, so I think it may well just have been an opportunistic local attack.
And yet it did take the Russians by surprise, because whatever the intention was at the time, Russia sent one of its toughest generals, didn't it? The Deputy Defense Minister, Yunusbek Yevkorov, he was sent within hours. So was Putin worried, do you think, at this stage, or was it just a showing that we can react to this?
I think it's more showing that Putin has got his hands on the reins. If we think back to Kursk and also the Prigozhin mutiny, I mean, Putin disappeared for a little bit of time, and the Russian response was pretty slow in coming. I think Putin has learned from both of those. He wants to be seen as a decisive, quick-acting leader, and I think sending this general there demonstrated that. We also saw the Russians be able to respond pretty quickly this time without the traditional slowness that we saw earlier in the war.
Just to talk about some latest political updates, the US's pick, Donald Trump's pick for US Special Envoy to Ukraine, General Kellogg, has indicated that he will bring the war to an end within 100 days of the inauguration. I mean, what do you make of that statement now?
Well, it's certainly, I guess, a more realistic proposition than the 24 hours, which Donald Trump appears to have moved away from. And it's not clear whether this is his personal aspiration or the incoming administration's aspiration. But, my sense is it'll take at least 100 days just to get both sides to agree to a negotiation, let alone get any kind of agreement. I mean, that first step of the whole process is kind of being assumed away. And I think we need to be careful about that, because I don't know that Vladimir Putin is in a mood to negotiate. He appears to think that he has the advantage at the moment, that the West has done nothing to stop him so far. So what would they do if he decided not to negotiate at this point in time?
Russia's highest priorities on the battlefield right now, is it fair to say they are Pokrovsk and Kursk? Can it do both? Can it kick Ukraine out of Russia and take Pokrovsk?
Well, it certainly appears to be able to take Pokrovsk. It's going to take them longer than they wanted to. But it looks like they will probably be able to do that eventually. Touretsk looks like it's close to falling. It's not quite there yet. Kursk's a little bit different because the Ukrainians really want to keep it as part of a negotiation. It's not a big bit of Russia, but it's always better to negotiate holding some of your enemy's territory than none of your enemy's territory. So I think Kursk is going to be a more difficult proposition for the Russians because the Ukrainians are defending there with very elite troops. And even Putin, I think, recognised this when in December he decided that he wasn't going to give a timeline for it. In fact, he said there isn't a timeline for this, whereas several months previously he directed he wanted it cleared by October.
And in that light, given this small operation into Kursk, this small, another counter-offensive, as it were, I mean, do you think, if that really is it, and it was a small demonstration of what the Ukrainians can do, was it worth it, do you think, in this political context, in this political landscape at the moment?
I think so. I mean, they don't appear to have expended a huge amount of resources. They don't appear to have had to commit additional brigades to it. It got attention back on Ukraine, which is important for the Ukrainian leader and Ukrainian people. And it would have given the soldiers a boost in morale, the Ukrainians a boost in morale, and just given the Russians another kick to say, hey, you're not running everything here. We still have agency. We still have the opportunity and capacity to hurt you. And that's an important message to send to the incoming American administration as well.
And at this stage in the war, some of the key challenges facing Ukraine's armed forces, you could summarise as troop shortages, exhaustion, too few experienced frontline officers, and relations between the battlefield and higher command. How should a modern military address these kind of problems? And are there other problems I haven't actually mentioned?
No, I think that's them by and large. The manpower problem really is the most compelling challenge that the Ukrainians have at the moment. Mobilisation started off well, but it's kind of petered out now. But within the mobilisation process, it's clear that the allocation of new troops between new brigades and existing brigades has some problems. The Ukrainians really seem to be keen to form new brigades when those troops might be better employed going to existing experienced brigades to train them up, but also reinforce existing front lines. I think command and control is a really interesting question. The Ukrainians have these regional commands above the brigades, which can have, a dozen or two brigades, and that's very difficult to wield as a senior commander. And while some have proposed divisions and corps like NATO armies, that may not be the solution anymore in 21st century land warfare, given the challenges of drones and greater visibility of the battlefield. Maybe we do need to really go back to the drawing board when it comes to military land force organisations for 21st century conflict.
And what do you think NATO can learn from what's happening in Ukraine from that?
Well, I think there's a huge amount of lessons. Obviously the technical ones when it comes to the use of drones, countering drones, air defence, electronic warfare. We've seen 3 instances of drones launching other drones in the last month, including the Battle of Lipsy, which was all drones. So they're important technical lessons. There's also important tactical lessons that have doctrinal insights about how military operate, how militaries train their people, how they undertake tactical operations. And then finally, there's a whole lot of people lessons about training and the development of leaders for the kinds of very demanding yet austere circumstances that battlefield leaders will find themselves in 21st century warfare.
And I suppose when the political decisions are made also to supply, it's the expediency in which weapons and equipment can be brought to the front line.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one thing to promise weapons, but if you're waiting 6 months, I mean, that is an eternity for the Ukrainians. I mean, they have a learning and adaptation cycle, which is measured in hours, days, and weeks when you have to wait months. The situation can have changed 5 different times over that period. So we need to get better at delivering equipment more rapidly. We need to enhance the amount of equipment. But I think the most important thing in 2025 I'd like to see from the West is an actual strategy for what they would like to see out of this war. We have not seen a senior American leader say whether they actually want Ukraine to win or not, and neither of the candidates for the US presidential election would even say they wanted Ukraine to win. I think that's troubling.
I suppose post the 20th of January, we should get a clear idea of that.
Yeah, one would hope so. I think we will. Whether we'll like that answer or not, I'm not sure. I'm keeping an open mind. Certainly, just as it is in the UK, here in Australia, the attitude is it's not in anyone's interest for the leader of the free world to fail. And we're all hoping that the incoming President Trump makes good decisions about Ukraine as well as confronting China and other strategic problems.
Yeah, I'll ask you a little bit more about that in a moment. There were staggering Russian losses in 2024. Do you think President Putin can maintain those losses at this rate in 2025, given the manpower, the workforce problems he has back home?
Yeah, I mean the figures are, as you say, absolutely staggering. I think the British Ministry of Defence intelligence folks put out a brief just in the last 48 hours that shows average casualties per month in 2022, 2023, which was higher, and then 2024, which was almost double per month. It's hard to imagine any country that can sustain average casualties around 1,500 to 2,000 every single day, day in, day out. Now, Russia's a big country, but even it is having problems with getting more volunteers. You've seen pay rates go up. You've seen recruitment bonuses continue to skyrocket in Russia. You see this year being the year of the veteran. I think even Putin will have problems sustaining that for the long term because he really does not want to go into another mobilization push. Even for a dictator, that will be problematic.
You have in your deep dive analysis, a new sort of vocal analysis of the situation in your Substack. You've outlined what you see as Russia's military and political objectives for 2025. What are they?
Yeah, there's a few different ones. In the military side of things, clearly getting the Ukrainians out of Kursk and seizing Pokrovsk and as much of the Donbass as possible is an important military objective. But they also want to be able to attrit and to wear down the Ukrainian military as well as Ukrainian society writ large over the course of the year. Politically, for Putin, he clearly wants to be able to sustain his alliances, even though they're not formal alliances, but his arrangements with China, North Korea, and Iran to provide the enabling support they do for this war, not just materially, but diplomatically, economically, and propagating misinformation. He wants to continue his hybrid warfare against European countries to ensure that they moderate their support for Ukraine. We've seen sabotage, we've seen anchor dragging across internet cables and these kind of things. That will continue, if not be enhanced. And I think a final important political objective for Putin, besides keeping as much of this war away from his people as possible, is to influence the incoming Trump administration. And I think part of his accelerated tempo of operations in the last few months has been entirely about putting a perception in the incoming Trump administration minds that Russian victory is inevitable and coercing Ukraine into some kind of accommodation is an urgent priority for the Trump administration.
Yeah, and on that note of influencing the incoming Trump administration, how much was President Zelensky's recent interview, that 3-hour interview with the Moscow-born US podcaster Lex Friedman earlier this week, how much was that about sending a message to Trump? And what do you think he wanted to achieve with that interview?
Yeah, it's certainly about sending a message to Trump and elements of the conservative movement in the United States. Lex Friedman has certainly got a lot of listeners, unfortunately, in the United States and other countries. So I think it was wise of Zelensky to get that platform to be able to engage conservative listeners in the United States and other countries as well. And it was a very extensive interview. I mean, Zelensky's a pretty good performer when it comes to these kind of things. He was certainly on message. And I think the key message was, help us to defeat Russia. We're not asking for boots on the ground. We're not even asking for your resources. Just give us all of Russia's, reserves that you've been able to take from them, and we'll use that to finish the job.
And also, I suppose, a sort of stress on the fact that the US security guarantees were what he saw as the absolute priority above everything else in terms of security guarantees.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think there is a peace solution without security guarantees. And as he said, it's very much appreciated when groups of Europeans get together to provide security assurances when individual countries like the United Kingdom and others sign these security assurances. But at the end of the day, the most important and the really non-discretionary security guarantor for Ukraine in the future is the United States. I think he's right there. A ceasefire without some kind of mechanism to ensure that any peace continues through the security guarantees of the US and NATO will be, I think, a very short peace.
You speak to us, Mick, from Australia, obviously. How has the security landscape, do you think, changed in the Asia-Pacific in the almost 3 years since Russia launched this full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
Well, certainly countries like China, Japan, Taiwan have been watching this very closely. I've been to Taiwan and Japan in the last couple of years. They have, discussed with me what they've observed about the war. I think we're seeing investments by China about what they've learned, particularly in nuclear weapons and the power of nuclear deterrence, autonomous systems, and these kind of things. Now, the Western Pacific is not Ukraine, and you need to really go through a process of translating the lessons for the wide expanses of littoral and ocean that we have in the Pacific region. But the basic concepts around drones, around air and missile defence, about national will of the people, about civil defence, I think are equally important in the Western Pacific as they are in Europe.
And what about North Korea? Because do you think its involvement of its troops makes it more dangerous now and pose greater threat from what it is learning in Ukraine? Because speaking at the UN Security Council, Deputy US Ambassador to the UN has indicated that is the case.
Yeah, I think you will see, this learning community emerge between Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. There's already a Russia-Iran learning community. Dima Adamski has written about that, but I think there's a larger one between the four of them. From what we've seen of the Koreans on the battlefield so far in Kursk, they can only improve. They've been woeful. And they can only learn and improve from their experiences in Ukraine. And I don't believe the South Koreans will like that. The region won't like it. I guess the other difference between Europe and the Western Pacific is Europe only has to really deal with the security threat from Russia. We have to deal with North Korea, China, and Russia, which is also a Pacific power. Indeed, its submarine fleet in the Pacific is bigger than Japan's.
And we mentioned China earlier. Do you think the details of any ceasefire in Ukraine are actually going to influence China's strategic decision making over Taiwan, for example, in the South China Sea, in terms of how Ukraine emerges out of any ceasefire that's agreed and any deal that's agreed?
I think so. But even before a ceasefire, I've written before, I think China sees it in its interest for this war to go for as long as possible. It keeps Europe focused on Europe. It keeps the Americans with a partial focus on Eastern Europe rather than on China and the Western Pacific. And it keeps draining Russia, which is a long-term strategic competitor for China. They're not really friends. They just have some shared mutual interests at the moment. So, the Chinese won't help peace. I don't know they'll stand in the way of it. But they will be watching very closely if there is some kind of ceasefire. They'll be looking at how the West made decisions about that and how that kind of Western strategic decision-making process might be subverted by them in some kind of future conflict.
And just looking ahead now to the coming months and weeks, what are you going to be most keenly looking out for?
Well, I think we need to, first and foremost, really watch the initial statements of the Trump administration after Trump has inaugurated. Those first few weeks, I think, will be very important. They will either give Ukraine and Europe confidence or they won't. So we'll wait and see. Obviously, we'll be watching to see Putin's reaction to that. As I said before, I'm not convinced he's ready to negotiate just yet, but that could all change on the 21st of January. And I think a third thing that I always look out for is what are the other strategic surprises not related to Ukraine that are around the corner that might have an influence on Ukraine? We saw it on 7 October 2023 in Israel. That had a major impact on the Ukraine campaign. We saw it with Israel's campaigns in Gaza against Hezbollah and Iran. What else might happen in 2025 outside Eastern Europe that will have a significant impact on NATO and United States attention and decision making?
And in that light, almost mean for me to say so, but is there anything in your peripheral vision there?
Well, I think the Chinese certainly are at least rehearsing some kind of blockade of Taiwan. They will be looking at just how strong Trump administration is in its initial weeks and its posture towards China. But certainly the Chinese are doing a lot of things against Vietnam, the Philippines, the Japanese, and other countries that they feel that we probably haven't pushed back on enough. And I think we'll continue to see an escalation of that kind of behaviour, as well as these very large-scale, short-notice joint exercises like Joint Swords A and B that we saw conducted by China in 2024.
Sounds like it's going to be an extremely busy year. Mick Ryan, it's great to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Kate. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.